You know, there are these companies out there that are so fundamental to our daily lives, they're practically invisible. They make the materials that, well, that make other materials. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of these giants by cracking open the official annual report of Japan's Nippon Shokubai.
So let's start with just one number to give you a sense of scale. 409.3 billion yen. That is their consolidated revenue for the last fiscal year. A number that big immediately tells you, okay, we are dealing with a serious global player here.
And that, of course, leads to the big question. When you see a number like that, you have to ask, what in the world are they making and selling to bring in that kind of cash? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into.
All right, so let's properly meet the company. Nippon Shokubai is a huge force on the world's chemical stage, but odds are, it's not exactly a household name. We're going to break down what they're all about. Here's the most important thing to get your head around. Founded way back in 1941, Nippon Shokubai doesn't make the stuff you buy off the shelf. No, they make the essential building blocks, the chemicals and catalysts that other companies use to make those products. It's like they're making the ingredients for the ingredients.
Now, to really understand who they are today, you kind of have to look at where they came from. Their history, stretching back over 80 years, is a really fascinating story of innovation and slow, steady global growth.
This timeline really maps out their whole journey. So they kick things off in 1941, go public about a decade later, and then boom, 1983. This is a big one. They start making something called superabsorbent resins. Trust me, we're going to come back to that. By 88, they're in the US, and by 91, they get the name we know today.
So you might be wondering, how on earth is a company this massive even organized? Well, their entire operation, everything they do, really boils down to two core business segments. And if you understand these two, you pretty much understand the whole company.
And this lays it out perfectly. On one side, you've got materials. Think massive factories pumping out huge volumes of fundamental chemicals. On the other side, you've got solutions. This is the high-tech stuff, specialty chemicals designed to solve very specific problems for other industries. So one is all about scale, and the other is all about precision.
Okay, let's dive into that materials business. This is where we find their absolute star player, superabsorbent resins. This is the magic stuff inside diapers that can absorb an insane amount of liquid. It is the perfect example of their products being hidden in plain sight. They also make the basics, like acrylic acid for paints and ethylene oxide, which is a foundational building block for tons of other chemicals.
Now let's hop over to the solutions business. Here, the game totally changes. They're making things like special polymers that make concrete way stronger, catalysts that literally clean up car exhaust, materials that are critical for the batteries in our gadgets, and chemicals for the electronics industry. These are not bulk items. These are targeted, high-value problem solvers.
So we've seen what they do, but the big question is, how's business? The annual report gives us a really clear picture of their financial health, and, maybe more importantly, where they're choosing to put their money.
Take a look at their revenue over the last 5 years. You can really see the story here. There was a big jump up in 2023, and what's really important is that they've pretty much stayed at that higher level. This isn't some company with wild ups and downs. They're operating at a consistently huge scale.
And who's making all that happen? Well, it's a global workforce. As of March 2025, we're talking about 4,685 employees working for Nippon Shokubai all around the world.
Now this is super telling. When you look at where they are investing in new factories and equipment, a whopping 85% is going right back into that core materials business. So what does that say? It says they're doubling down on their cash cow, protecting the heart of their business, and betting that the world is going to keep needing their foundational product.
So, a company this big doesn't just run itself. Which begs the question, who actually owns Nippon Shokubai? Who are the shareholders calling the shots? Well, what's fascinating is that the ownership is incredibly spread out. There's no single person or group in control. Instead, it's a really balanced mix of banks, other companies, foreign investors, and regular individuals. This is pretty typical for a major public company in Japan.
And even if we zoom right in on the biggest shareholders, you see a couple of trust banks and the energy giant Ineos. But look at the top holder, the Master Trust Bank. They're at just under 12%. This just reinforces the idea that power here is really distributed among many different owners.
Okay, we've covered a ton of ground here. The history, the products, the money, the ownership. So let's try to pull all this together and figure out what it all means. So what's the big picture? At its core, Nippon Shokubai is a deeply rooted, financially rock-solid chemical giant. They run a very smart business, split between those huge-scale materials and the high-value solutions. And probably the main takeaway is that their most important products are things you've almost certainly used today without ever knowing their name.
You know, you can learn a lot about a company just by reading their mission statement. Theirs says, "We provide affluence and comfort to people and society with our technology." It's a pretty grand way of connecting all their complex chemistry back to the everyday lives of regular people.
And that brings us right to the future, because when you look closely at their annual report, you get a really clear signal about their priorities. Their research and development money is now squarely focused on sustainability. We're talking about things like capturing CO2 and making chemicals from plants instead of fossil fuels.
Which leaves us with one final fascinating question. For a company that has spent over 80 years mastering traditional chemical manufacturing, what does it actually take to pivot? How does a giant like this transform its very core to lead in a new, sustainable era? Honestly, that's the real story to watch.